terms of our disposition on the history of social justice in man's favour, which is what he was threatening to do. So we are going to start with some questions to you, really, rather than some questions to the ether, and we'd like to hear from you. And the question that we've been posed, or the question posed by Mike, is simply this. What is or should ethnomethodology's relationship to social science be? And is that different, there's an implied question there, to the relationship that radical ethnomethodology should have to social science? Well, I take it in the room, by and large, are ethnomethodologists. Whether you regard yourself as radicals or not, that's to be seen. But I think what we'd like to hear is, what are you doing and how do you think it relates to social science? And you're free to choose social science as a generic name for everything, from linguistics south or north, whichever way you want to go, ending up in psychology or wherever. Or indeed, social science as a branch, of which sociology is one, psychology is another, and all the rest. So you get to choose what you mean by social science. But we'd like to hear from you all, or as many of you as can get into the conversation, what you do and what you think the relationship to social science is. And if there is anything more than 15 seconds silence, I'm going to pick on something. Careful now.
Okay, I'll start.
Works every time.
I can only speak for myself, of course, but there are two things that I see as having been hugely informative to me in the Ethnomethodology program. One is doing the studies, that there are continuing and there will always be opportunities to do the studies in a whole variety of arenas. There is no limit to the number of arenas in which we can do the studies. That's point one. Point two is what I would call the resolute critique. Jeff, of course, is well known for his critique of psychology. The same critique applies to sociology. But a sustained and resolute critique of the concepts, the methods, the theories that the disciplines constantly speak to would be one of the things that is important to me. Those two things together inform my interest in ethnomethodology.
Is that so? Do you, just to turn it back to the way I formulated the question, do you therefore see your relationship to sociology or social sciences, or how you want to call it, as one of critique?
I do. Of course, the word critique needs a lot of unpacking here, doesn't it? Because sociology itself thinks of itself as a critical discipline in some rather odd sense. My complaint, I guess, in relation to all of the social and human sciences is their strange admixture of grandiosity and triviality. That huge claims are made on the back of very little. And it seems to me that, I mean, again, I can only speculate about what the future might mean for younger people who are engaged in the ethnomethodological program, but that critique has some practical possibilities inherent in it. We see in the context of the virtual world, etc. It's hard to talk about these things without sounding like you're interested in hyperbole, but when I see the strange fears there are in, for instance, quantitative social science about issues like the Internet of Things, machine learning, and so on, and I see the opportunities there are to do the studies in areas of this kind, I see no reason for any fear. There are lots of possibilities here. Whether this is radical or not is of no great concern to me, but I do think the opportunities to do the studies are no less than they ever were. The critique, as it were, is a critique, as I say, of methodological fetishism, disciplinary theory, the inability to recognize that the theories you deploy are not the only choices that are possible in the world, conceptual meaninglessness, for a better way of putting it, vagueness, the endless Wittgensteinian critique of the appearance of a technical term which is not a technical term, this is the kind of critique that I'm interested in.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone come from a different point of view, a different... Over my shoulder there. Oh, sure, carry on.
Speaking for myself and Mark and Andy, I think we're in an interesting situation because we work in computer science.
Yeah.
And our relationship with social science could effectively be zero if we chose for it to be so. The way it impacts upon us, and as we know, we've written focus of Graham as well, is that computer science itself tries to borrow from social science extensively in various ways. And where we engage with social science and we engage in corrective is because often it works with it in a very underinformed way. And so often we have to produce accounts of what a reasonable approach might be, because otherwise there's a danger of serious misrepresentation of what social science might be about and what it could contribute to computer science in the first place. So that's where we sit.
Yeah, that raises yet another question, which comes out of this morning's discussion and also some of the things that people were touching on, which is what to make of this somewhat obscure notion of hybrid studies, which was offered as one of the ways of dealing with sociology by going somewhere else. The question, I guess, to be directed to you three in particular, maybe, because you just pointed at yourselves, is whether you regard yourselves as engaged in hybrid studies, and if not, why not?
Yes, I would consider myself to be engaged in a hybrid enterprise. I think it's not merely doing something like requirements engineering, requirements caching, for example. We are seeking to make a foundation of environmental computing and ways in which computing orients to the social world and engages with it. So for me, I don't care about speaking sociology. I'm not interested in sociology in this way. I do care about active computer science, or at least that part of computer science, which is very diverse enterprise, which is interested in other people part of business and how that gets run and how that's used.
Absolutely, because the case is not that we write social scientific accounts and throw them over the wall for the two computer scientists and our guests. Instead, we sit actively in rooms and work with computer scientists and shape those accounts in all sorts of practical ways in order to do the work of design.
It works in manifold ways. It works all the way through the stack, from writing research proposals, getting money in the door, doing studies, shaping computer systems, evaluating them, all the computer stuff that goes along with that. Obviously, the academic side representing work, etc. And yeah, our audience, our target, our partners in crime bureau are computer scientists.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, carry on.
Yeah. The book that you and Graham wrote about ethnography, which was a follow-up of a paper that I heard about through some of the people at Cornell, former students of mine and stuff, who said, these guys are real assholes. Why are they attacking us?
Well, they are naturally.
This was, reading the book, I found it, very interesting, and I agreed with it. And although I don't have much contact with the kinds of, practices you're studying, it could easily be a critique of social science in many areas, including science and technology studies, which abuts with some of the people you're criticizing. So you are engaged in, at least on one front, with social sciences that many of these people are employed in information science departments and have hybrid positions of their own, and they do, I just went to a conference at Siegen about this sort of stuff. That's where ran into Dave. They're doing quite successfully moving into that space, but they're doing social science of a very recognizable sort, symbolic interactionism or something of that sort. So you are kind of engaged with them, right? I mean, you can't avoid them.
But it's in the context of computer science. I don't see the critique that Graham and ourselves worked on in constructing technology as being fundamentally directed at the social sciences. The constant caveat there is for system developers to consider the consequences of taking different approaches to the ones that traditionally. The confusion is, again, we set out in the book, is ethnography. Right? It's all ethnomethodology is passed off as ethnography in its origins. So we set out to deconstruct the very notion that actually what has to work is ethnography. really what it was about to some large extent was ethnomethodology. I'm not saying there was no other things in there at all, but we wanted to put that view on the table and say, look, if you turn to these other approaches, which are also called consolidated, that you probably find yourself a whole lot of trouble. So the target again was all developers and IT developers and IT computer science researchers. At no point, a great amount of different jobs, obviously, but for me, I was never talking to sociology, never talking to anthropology, never talking to
I don't want to shut down a conversation of this kind, but I also don't want to turn it into a critique or an analysis of Andy's and his team's work. I think there are other people in the room and they have voices that we need to hear as well. What I would like to hear, though, because that is quite distinct from the first positioning, which is a conversation with sociology directly. And this is a conversation with disciplines informed by a understanding of sociology, etc., but it's in a different place. Now, there must be other people in the room who work with professions like social work, I'm thinking of particularly, or like criminologists, or what other spaces where you might not define yourself in quite as clear way as Andy and his team do. But I'd like to hear how you do define yourself. If you study managers, for example, how do you define yourself in terms of management science? Does anybody do that? If you work in hospitals, how do you define yourself in terms of medical science or organizational science? So I'm trying to answer your question. Jump in.
In relation to the medicine, we have been working with different disciplines like radiologists and also with dentists. And I think one of the lessons from those collaborations have been that you always have to decide on the audience for some of the publications coming out of that is for radiology journals. As you say, you write for them. And that would never be recognized within this group as coming from being informed by ethnomethodology. But we can also, sometimes we choose to make studies of the practice that are more focusing on issues that are related to sociology or other social sciences.
Is that trade-off a difficult one for you to make, John?
Not
Come on,
really.
you two, jump in.
I think it comes out of necessity. We have tried to make, in some cases, we wanted to make an argument that sort of combines the organisms. That doesn't work. You can't really publish that anywhere. So you have to make to be clear from the outset. So where is this going? What kinds of arguments are we developing? But as a whole project over years, you can have different facets of it, and those you can work around the complex with the professionals, and you can also draw on their expertise and don't have to develop full sort of adequacy within the method that you study, because there's always more people that you want to rely on once you get a collaboration going.
I'd like to pick up on the notion of dentistry for a second, because a colleague of mine, Tim Anderson, wrote a very interesting dissertation called Behavior in Painful Places, which was about the work of dentists. And one of the things that he came up with is the notion that dentists do tend to have pain-minimizing rhetorical strategies, like, this is only going to be a little pinch, or you're not going to feel this very much, stuff like that, you know. And so at one point, so he takes some of his ideas to a couple of dentists, and they say, yeah, that's absolutely right, that's exactly what we do, and thank you for telling us that that's what we're doing, because that's what we do, and we hadn't really recognized that that's what we do and how we do it. So then, you know, they develop further strategies of pain and anxiety minimization, somewhat based on Anderson's insights.
And I think that's the way that these collaborations work.
Yeah.
Our descriptions, our attempts at describing that the practice gets read and sort of tested on the practitioners.
Sure.
And they have to recognize it, but sometimes they also see something new in the way that they work and that they haven't really put words on or like that. So it's, and you can work on that and develop that into something new.
One, two, so.
Well, I suppose a more line as such. I teach in a sociology department, I teach sociology. When I do work, I tend to read sociological, anthropological, philosophical, theoretical texts, not because I'm totally looking for guidance, but to see how other people have approached these problems. I find it useful thinking with in a variety of different ways. The reading group that Wes has run for many, many years, we look at a whole range of stuff. Sometimes it's informative, sometimes it's not, sometimes it can be easily dismissed, sometimes it can't. And some of the work I've done with Wes as well, we studied social scientists at work. We looked at statisticians, and it turns out their practices and activities are poorly understood by many as well. And so it's not quite as simple, and I think in some respects the relationship can't be set out once and for all. I think it's often occasioned, and I think it's developing, and it depends what trajectory and certain projects you may be drawn to over the course of the work that you do. So I don't think it's necessarily something which can be straitjacketed in any one particular way. I think there's a wide variety of examples to draw upon.
I was just going to say that that's what I like about what I do. I work in early childhood studies, so I teach people who maybe are going to be teachers, and I also do research in early childhood settings, and they really appreciate just for what it is, you know, the work that you do in sort of CA, because they can see things that, you know, that they maybe didn't notice they were doing, you know, and I like that lack of, you know, that lack of rejection that you get from sociology. Dave was my PhD supervisor, and he told me to, you know, go somewhere outside the sociology department because they'll respect you for what you do. So I did.
Well done.
You ask us how we relate to our understanding of ethnomethodology in relation to other disciplines. And so the way that I understood Garfinkel's work would be something compared to this prehistoric creature, half lizard, half bird, and is constantly in a struggle to evolve into something what is not. There are rudiments of the new, but it's still not developed because there are forces dragging it back into the mud, which unfortunately snake came and dragged him back into the mud, but there's a still promise of developing something that is new out of that old. And this is what I was referring to, a promise, that there is something other than that. And what that other is something that is not part of social science. All right, so the sociology is in the mud. What ethnomethodology has to offer is something altogether different and unknown to anything other than whatever work reveals things to be. So in that sense, if we want to talk about what is the ethnological relationship to other disciplines, to be consequential, we have to arrive at this analysis from the analysis of the developed work. In other words, where does this work lead us to this unknown domain that work itself delivers? And also to accept that actually, you know, this is not anymore sociology. And therefore we should not be asking to anchor ourselves. Like if we are spreading the wings, then we don't need gravities, right? And so in that sense, it is also a radical anti-utilitarianism. In other words, I really don't want to help anybody, right? And it's not our task to help anybody, right? Our task is to figure out what our work is giving us as a legitimate claims, and then to stick to those boundaries as a step for a new development that I don't know what it is. And so in that sense, I think actually I don't know what I think.
That's a wish to respect that view, but that is a very distinctive view, and one that I think many people would find it hard to accommodate themselves to, given the other constraints in their lives, like having to write justifications for why they should get sabbaticals or whatever it might be. We live in an institutional environment in which I like doing it, so therefore I ought to do it, is probably the lowest order justification you can offer. I'm not denying that it's right, I'm just saying, the question I have for other people is that how you feel? Or do you feel constrained in different ways in different
We
people?
want to influence people, and that's why we're a computing department. We want to influence design in various ways. That's what we do. I think of myself more as an ethnographer than an ethnomethodologist. I'm not very good at ethnomethodologist, but all I do are user studies of one kind or another to inform design. And I do the shape of requirements, and I'm shaping evaluation and redesign. And the reason why computer scientists like our stuff is that it's relatively easily comprehensible, as opposed to social sciences that usually hide what they're trying to do behind either some kind of methodological gizmo or against some kind of theoretical construction. That is, to understand what we do, you don't need to understand postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-feminism. They can just read it.
We can talk it, we can see it.
So yeah, we do want our work to impact on people.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean,
But it's still part of the structural functional attitude and a part of sociology. And traditionally, at least in the United States, many people who chose to study sociology in beginning 20th century are the ones who actually begin with theology. So they figure out sociology is a secular theology. Therefore, we really have to help people, right, in a way the church used to do, but we can do that through science. And so structural functionalism is a form of, everything is one, right? We're part of the system.
I'm not here to buy into that at all.
No, I'm not saying that you are buying into it, I'm just saying, okay.
But I think an important question to ask is, what's the contribution of that?
Well, but that's
Because
the,
if you don't make a contribution, why the hell should work out if it's funded by the taxpayer?
right.
Can I just intervene here? Because my question would be, does anybody think that ethnomethodology makes discoveries? And if so, what are they discovering? Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it make, because we talk about it generating novelties. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I also want to come in on the tenor of the conversation. There are strong opinions held in the room by people about their own work and about other people's work. But I do not want this session, I think we want this session, to turn into decrying each other's work. What we're trying to find out here is what we do and how we think about it. Not how we judge it, how we judge each other's work. So we got close to what's appearing to be a shouting match, and I really don't want that.
Well, isn't the point?
It's all right.
Isn't the point here that you can view this discoveries for whom?
Hang on, yeah, there's a question on the table, Dave. Can we just stay with that for a minute? Right, come on, say again, because I didn't hear it.
Yeah, so my answer, as it were, to Jeff's question about discoveries is discoveries for whom? There is clearly a sense in which ethnomethodology does make discoveries for people who didn't know that. If you do a study of whatever, markets in Wales, for the sake of argument, there is a discovery there for people who theorise about markets and did not know that markets function in that way. So yes, it does make discoveries in respect of particular kind of audience.
Dave?
Well, it's just there's all sorts of ways of looking at the relationship between ethnomethodological inquiries and the stuff that they inquire about. One of them, only one of them, is to say that we're parasites. Yeah? We're parasitic upon people engaged in childhood, people who work in nurseries with young kids, or people who take people's teeth out. We're parasitic upon those people because we go in, we do a bit of filming, we talk to them, we try and get inside the activity, inside the setting, but we do that for our purposes, not for theirs.
No,
mean, that's
I
it.
disagree.
Well,
because
yeah, hang on.
if you're
Whoa,
invited-
let him,
Hang
hang on a minute, let him
Hang
finish
on.
his
That's
point.
one way of thinking about it, yeah? But of course, you know, we're very successful in a way that most sociology isn't, for precisely the reasons that Wes identified this morning, which is that we actually look at the detail of what gets done and how it gets done. We're actually interested in what is in the data. Yeah, you know, when we go in and look at this stuff, we actually do look at it. You know? So almost inevitably, there's a positive outcome, or a potential positive outcome from that, for these people that we're parasitic of. Yeah, because it turns out, more cases than not, that we come up with stuff that's interesting, useful to them. Yeah, and you know, given that that's the case, and that's almost always the case, given the kinds of studies we do, then it's perfectly reasonable for, you know, for someone like Andy to say, well, that's my main priority. Yeah, the stuff I do is useful to these people, therefore, you know, that's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in doing stuff that's useful to them. I'm, you know, in that sense, I'm not just getting inside the phenomenon. You know, I'm aligning myself with the phenomenon. Well, that's perfectly reasonable. I don't see anything wrong with that. You know, the very nature of the stuff you do makes that possible. Yeah? But you don't have to view it that way. View it in a quite, you know, I like being a parasite. Well, I used to. I don't do it.
Okay, has anybody got a point of view that's different?
I have recently I have a student whom I was supervised. I was asked to supervise a student from the sociology department, and I kind of introduced him to a medical social worker because he wanted to study some kind of services to, I mean, kind of consultation services to different patients. So, and then the medical social worker was kind of expecting first, because he was a sociology student, he kind of expected that he would criticize their work according to kind of Graham's theory. And then when we kind of trying to say like that's what you're not going to do, and it's something we do is to look into their practice in detail and understand first, and they say something possibly interesting in the end. And then he was quite puzzled first, but then he started reading some of our work, and then now he's quite anxious to read what he will be doing, this student will be doing, but well, it's still kind of not finished. So, and then I have another example. I'm in a department of in library and information science, and I have a student from library, university library, who kind of wanted to study what he does in reference counter, but then he wasn't quite sure how he would analyze what he does, and then I didn't really insist that he would do ethnomethodology, and I didn't. I kept quiet, but gradually I kind of guided him to study the practice on its own. And then he now seems to be really intrigued to the kind of things what he is getting out of his out of records of their services, and he seems to find it really interesting to be able to kind of study what they do in a systematic way, which he never saw in other library and information science discipline. And now he reads ethno stuff, and he defended himself in a really nice way in front of other faculty members who were quite critical about his studies, what he was doing. And that was really kind of interesting phenomena which I just experienced actually. And I have some kind of hope, kind of feeling that some of the stuff which we do is not, we do might we won't say like, okay, we do this to help or to contribute to something, but yet, if as far as we stuck in what we do, and how we do it in a methodological way, then it will speak up to the audience who would want to listen to it, and that's the kind of thing I feel that I am experiencing, and I'm fairly hopeful in that way.
Okay.
And I'm sorry that I can't
Yeah, yeah.
really formulate the relationship between ethno and social science per se, but I just wanted to deliver two episodes.
You've read.
I think that's sorry.
Well, if you'd like to finish, yes.
Well, I just thought that's a really nice thing you said, insofar as we are stuck in the MCA. Did you say that? Insofar as we are stuck, as we are in the MCA, and we can show it to other people, and that's really nice. That's what I was sort of saying. That's what's really nice when you meet somebody who doesn't maybe have a background in sociology and hasn't got a way of thinking about things that's in terms of mainstream sociology. It's nice to introduce them to it, and so in that way you're doing something, aren't you?
In a sense, I'm sort of picking up on this. I left sociology just after I got my PhD, and I've worked in linguistics departments, English departments, communication, journalism, and cultural studies. And what's kind of nice about that is they welcome you with open arms each time you go. And they wouldn't employ me if they didn't think there was worth within those things. And rather than seeing those kind of new disciplines as parasitic, if you sort of I think of them as being carpetbaggers, that they're bringing in all different things. There's historians, there's sociologists, there's qualitative, there's all these different kind of like people coming together in these new things. And so therefore, my kind of contribution to that, I'm seen as the kind of methods guy, the qualitative method guy. I can work with different people, I can publish in different kind of like sort of forms according to the audience. So some of it wouldn't pass muster as ethnomethodology, much of it wouldn't pass muster as ethnomethodology, but in a sense it's kind of learning how to write in that way is the kind of principle of ethnomethodology, is to do the thing you are being part of. In a sense of learning how to write for a communication audience or an English audience or a journalism audience, is that kind of that detailed study of how to do this thing. I think that's kind of, that contribution is what I bring to my field, and they seem to be kind of happy with that.
This, I mean, I'll come back, Doug, if I can. It's just, Andy raised it starkly in that he has no, I won't make it, I'll say it as I heard you, Andy, and we won't bother with correcting it. As if you've got no allegiance to sociology anymore, you're staring straight at computer science, and that's what you're about. And that's institutionally, I'm not talking about intellectually, I'm talking about institutionally. And then others have said, no, they're rooted in that strange melange, which is a kind of sociology, social science that's got philosophy bound up in it, and anthropology and all sorts of other things. And other people don't seem to be rooted in either place, but are rooted elsewhere. And that for me raises a question that was touched on almost at the end about the institutional basis, and whether we think we need one for ethnomethodology, for radical ethnomethodology, or whether in fact the institutional bases are going to be where we work. So is there a different institutional base? And again, remember, I'm not asking for you personally or for your own personal opinions here. It's about the collectivity. It's what we think about for the collectivity. Andy, can I ask somebody else first? And Doug is sitting there with a question.
No, it's not a question. I just want to throw something into the conversation. And it's on topic, I think, of, okay, so is this enterprise, is it sociology, is it relation to sociology, is it an alternate, etc. I mean, I think it's on topic. But from the mid to late 80s on for a while, Garfinkel made multiple references to, what do I call it, collections. I think that's the term used. The notion was an assemblage of exemplary cases of X, whatever X may be. And as I want to say, as an instructive collection. And so the question is sort of instructive for whom? And I want to say, like listening to Sally, we could say, and I'm quite,
a number of domains in which the work seems to be something about descriptions of practice that sort of stand out of view. And so if you had a collection of exhibits, right, of domains of practice standing out of view, which you're not recommending them as a sociologist, what sense would that make to that community? Is that something that we could imagine? You actually had a collection of collections for, whatever this intellectual domain is, I want to say not for our consumption, not duly noted, duly cited, duly bibliographed ethnomethodology, but rather as descriptions of the enterprise of pulling teeth. But actually some of the nicest stuff, Oscar had a special collection on medical practice, and some of the nicest stuff are these descriptions of how these young dental technicians are learning how to keep their fingers out of the way, okay, when they're fishing around in somebody's mouth. Well, that's a rather nice thing to have a description of, that could be really quite instructive. So is there a thing, just open that up as a matter of was it collections that you speak of? It was in the blue book.
Some of the coat hangers.
Well, that coat hangers was another way of speaking of that.
Yeah.
Yes. But the exemplary descriptions intended as of their instructors.
Conspicuous cases.
Yes. And so the question of discovery, well, I know it's discovery, but it could be revelation. Right? I mean, from within domains of the practice. So that's just another way of thinking about it. And if I had to come up with an exemplar right now, and it's not too terribly focused, there are a handful of course I did, but Livingston's work on ethnographies of reason. There's some stunning descriptions of checkers or of various praxeology.
Yeah, they're awfully generic in a sense as well, aren't they? The dentist then you need a corpus of dentist
Yes,
studies. Yeah.
I quite agree.
And for legal studies and for mathematics,
Yes. Yes.
etc., etc.
Yes.
Which is perfectly reasonable proposition. And it kind of back to Bob's question about it's an institutional base. You can't really have an institutional base when ethnomethodology becomes so diverse and it's use application, call it what you will, how do you have a coherent institutional base? Maybe a digital one might be possible, but it still have to be, it have to face many audiences and many domains.
If we're talking about, I'm sorry.
No.
If we're going to talk about ethnomethodology in the social sciences, and primarily I think to this audience we're talking about sociology, one of the key issues in sociology classically has been the problem of meaning, right? And that obviously derives primarily from Max Weber, right? We define actions, behavior to which a subjective meaning is appended. And then of course,
You've got your 40 minutes coming.
and no time, cut me off any time. And then of course we have to move to Schutz from Weber, who says, well, I mean, it's not so much subjective meaning as maybe intersubjective meaning, because then we have to have a distinction between meaning as intelligibility and meaning as personal significance. So, you know, what Liverpool means to me may not be what Liverpool means to you, because I was born there, I know the city well, blah, blah, blah. But what Liverpool means is that it's the name of a city on the coast, the northwest coast of England, right? So as soon as you get into that area, then we can see that there's different forks out of Max Weber and this whole business of subjectivity and meaning. And ethnomethodology takes the line of having a look at intelligibility. That doesn't mean that it neglects personal significance, but it treats the personal significance of something as something that's available through the intersubjective character of its disclosure, right? So, you know, it's not like you neglect that aspect of meaning, it's incorporatable, but the primary focus is on intelligibility. And intelligibility, of course, is necessarily not subjective in the sense that we're not talking about what something means to me as distinct from what it means to you, but what it means, right, in the language that we speak and the society that we share.
So, great.
I don't want to cut off a discussion about what Jeff's just raised. I was going to raise this before, so if I could just raise it because it was topical.
one thing that we understand from ethnomethodology relationship to sociology is it's not been friendly, it's been acrimonious. And what we're hearing in terms of the relationship of ethnomethodology to other disciplines, it seems more cosy, or it's being portrayed as more cosy. I don't think that's necessarily the case with something like relationships with computer science. Because I don't think it started off being cosy, I think it started off being critical. So it was taking some of the major concepts that were being articulated within the design community, where a lot of those concepts have come from psychology, a lot of it has come from cognitive science, and it was holding up to scrutiny the veracity of those concepts and providing, if you like, critiques. So it wasn't a cozy relationship. So the people who are having more cozy relationships with their the disciplines that they're now inhabiting, I wonder if in some ways you may not be doing yourselves justice or doing the disciplines that you're working with justice. I've got in mind Gail Jefferson's critique of Anita Pomeranz in terms of the ways in which Anita was recasting some of ethnomethodology's questions in terms of that were articulated within communication studies, for example. So I wonder if those who are living within other disciplines, whether or not, if you reflect on it, would it not be better to have a more, I don't necessarily mean conflictual, but a more abrasive relationship with some of their major concepts, because that might then enable them to move forward as well as ourselves moving forward.
Can I just I'll probably talk shit as usual, but you know, putting that aside, I mean, I finished my PhD in Nottingham, and it was what I would classify as a radical ethnomethodological PhD. It was deliberately aligned that way. And since then I've been doing research studies, usually funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and other funding bodies. So I've got to deliver something, it's got to be useful, and I can't look at taxpayers' money. I've got an objective in the end there. I don't write those proposals by myself on a purely ethnomethodological basis. They're done as a teamwork with multiple disciplines in there. I have to justify my position within that team, and I have to be a useful member of that team to do something, to deliver something which is a task which has been determined in advance by whatever that proposal is, or whatever that call for research projects was for the thing. Ethnomethodologically, how on some occasions I've been able to do what would be very ethnomethodologically orientated, sometimes quite pure. Other times it's basically doing methods and making those practical methods, which are general social science methodologies, the best they can be by taking an ethnomethodological, epistemological critique towards the application of what those methods are and what those methods can be said to be going to deliver and what they can't be said to be going to deliver. And that actually is often seen rather than as an attack on people who may be very fond of those methods, but as a useful way of dealing with it and delivering the end product, which is usually a research report, which usually has a more priority than over some abstract discussion over a theoretical orientation within the sociological discourse of what is right or wrong within sociology. It's a different agenda. And so what I would say for me the importance has been, I still do ethnomethodological studies on the side, not funded, but they can be as pure as I want them to be, or as I can get them to be. But the other things is the contribution which, from my ethnomethodological understanding of the world and understanding of sociology and social sciences, as applied to the practice of doing research projects itself, which is a sort of different sort of, it's a practical ethnomethodology in the day-to-day work which I do. So although I'm not hired as an ethnomethodologist, I'm hired as a researcher, but I can sell why I'm to be the researcher who's to be hired because of the skills I have as doing research. And those are greatly informed and enhanced from my position by having been trained as an ethnomethodologist. So, so what I'm sort of saying is that it's not a binary. I buy ethnomethodology, or I'm going to do formal sociology, and I've got to kick the arses of formal sociologists to make a point about ethnomethodology. I'm doing a different game. I'm doing research, I'm doing studies, and within all the caveats available to how those can practically be done in the real world, I apply ethnomethodology as much as I can, as much as I can bring people along with me, and as much as it fits into the practical reality of doing a research project.
Yeah. So there are two Neil Jenkins, aren't there? There's Neil Jenkins, there's the main Neil Jenkins, yeah, who's a good team man, who has something to contribute, yeah, because he's, because he's smart and knows a lot of good stuff, right? But there's also a little Neil Jenkins, which is kept hidden most of the time. Yeah, no, there's a little Neil, I don't know where he is, but he's there somewhere. There's a little Neil Jenkins, right, who is thinking all the time, my God, I could do some really, really nice stuff with this. Yeah, and sometimes you let that little Neil Jenkins out, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes you can do that as part of the study. If
Right, Dave, therapy in public is not a good idea.
Two things. One is probably nearly all of us had to write or teach or do stuff that we, if any of the rest of us was to put under enormous scrutiny, we'd be a bit, no, I didn't believe that. I had to do that for a job. I had to do this, I had to do that. So I don't think it's that purity of the body of your work. But I think there's another thing which got people talking in the 70s, I believe, about having two bibliographies. And studies in ethnomethodology and studies about it. I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but the studies about ethnomethodology are the ones that I'm often most interested in, because that's how the implications of doing these kinds of studies, what that means for sociology, anthropology, cognitive science, etc., and the throwaway the quote in studies where it says, well, people can have non-affairs. People aren't, by and large, aren't interested, especially in the very mundane things, about being told, oh, you're asking me a question now, you're crossing the road now, why bother? There are some fields in which they might be interested in that. But Garth Gordon says these things aren't meant as ironies. You shouldn't do studies of things to try to make a point to sociology and so on. But the fact of you doing those studies is an enormous corrective. The fact that those studies can be done in that way, descriptively, without theory, without formal set of methods, and they make good use of what people are doing to do a description of that is in some way superior to what conventional sociology would make of those materials. I think that is an enormous corrective, and it does ironicize sociology. So I want to keep that link.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember a situation where Harold was to be a good citizen in relation to his community, and two situations came to my mind. One was when he asked to meet a person, a man who claimed that he is blind and has no hearing aid. And so he had some machine with which you could communicate. So Harold was very interested in talking to this person, and in the course of investigation, Harold ended up blaming him, saying that actually he's lying, that he actually, right, that actually he hears, or anyway, really.
This was one of David Good wrote a book called World Without Words, or something like that, about children born to a mother who had rubella syndrome, and the children were blind, deaf, and I think classified as retarded. This guy was not. He met through David, his network of people in disabled groups, met with Harold, and Harold was example I remember is, I think the article told it this way, was the fellow said he had gone to a football game. So Harold then said, question, how could he have been at a football game with no senses, right? And this insulted the man, right? It wasn't that he accused him of lying, but he questioned how this guy could have been, how he was at the game, as opposed to bodily in the stadium, right? And the question insulted him because it questioned the veracity of what he was saying, and he took it to be a questioning of his integrity and honesty, and so he refused to talk any further.
Right. So that's one. The other one instance is when he had a meeting with a person from Bell Labs. There was a phone company, and there was a possibility of getting some funds for ethnomethodological research. And so I think Doug was there with me, right? With the two of us, right? And he told us specifically not to talk because he's one who's going to take charge and he's going to deliver the most pragmatic thing to assure us that we're going to get the funding. And of course, it was completely opposite. The way that he presented the case, he started talking about standing in line and what does it mean to stand in line and why is that important for this person who has all this funding to finance people like him, why it's so important to understand how it is to be standing in line. And of course, all we got was sandwiches, and the guy left and never came back. And so here's the man, who is all into practical reasoning, right? He is into understanding everyday life world, and yet when you put him in this situation, he's antithesis to all of these things that actually he understands or has a deep understanding. So there's a kind of antidotal relationship to the phenomena of his own studies. Insistence on that might lead to hurting somebody's feelings, right? For him was more important to understand how is this possible rather than what the feelings of this person are, which tells me, so my question is, how am I supposed to understand this? And so the way I understand this is basically his relationship to a method, right? To the orthodoxy of the method. That is something that can only belong to the parasite, if I may use your term. And that actually he wants to create a community of parasites who are standing in an orthodox relationship to the method, which is supposed to act vis-a-vis society as an antidote. Because sometimes healing is done through dosages of poison, not always with the food. And so this is a far more complicated task of ethnomethodologists, in my senses, than to humanize the method. And if indeed we are parasites, I will be concerned with the parasites coming to me and say, I have a way of helping you. Because that can be just, parasite on square, more parasitic than it is. And sometimes ethics of ascesis, it's also an ethical thing, which is to say, I am consciously abstaining from helping as actually a way of helping, protecting society from parasites like as I am.
Protecting society from yourself.
I think we should all take a self-denial ordinance on that.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting point that parasite comes up repeatedly, and I'm wondering maybe if we're not symbiotic in a certain extent. Like the pilot fish circles the shark and eats some of the garbage off the shark's skin, and the shark's quite happy to have the pilot fish as a parasite. Right? It's a parasite relationship. The pilot fish won't exist without the shark yet. But
Dave has got a lot to be responsible for, and that image is going to be one of them.
Yeah, never mind that. It's sort of just a passing off.
Well, to read Michelle's share.
Is it one of the challenges that we face that's sort of unique to ethnomethodology as opposed to other branches, particularly sociology, but also the rest of, let's say, more or less political science, the more interpretive branches of psychology, philosophy, and maybe not the more formulaic versions of psychology, let's call them sciences. Whoever else you want to lump in that group, human geographers, whatever, doesn't really matter. Is that we have achieved such phenomenal success in environments outside of our traditional home in sociology where we were birthed out of. So in CSCW and HCI, where we've had such phenomenal success communicating with others. In laboratory studies and STS, where we've had such phenomenal success in communicating not only to other academics who have an interest in history, who have an interest in practical reasoning. And these have been excellent perspective sites for discussion. In legal studies, where we have people like Stacey Burns, who are involved in hybrid studies that are incredibly successful on that front. And perhaps the remainder of sociology has taken upon itself, and let's single out sociology because I think we've all worked in, so we've always heard the stereotype of a sociologist who's more or less the activist, and that maybe is that character that we build in our mind when we think of the other sociologist, the one who's interested in the extent of which they might communicate with people outside of sociology and within their very narrow niche in sociology would be other activists in that field. So people who want to talk about the numbers, right, or who are informing statistical research and these types of things. So that we have been so successful in branching out away from sociology might distract us from the actual very concrete success we've had within sociology itself. And I think some of those things were manifested, especially last year at the ASA when we had a fantastic panel session on Agnes and this really amazing piece of research that Garfinkel did. That it is so delicate, but also was very instrumental in that movement in feminist studies and informing things like Candace West's work and informing that entire body of performative gender, Judith Butler, that came out of that now informs so much beyond just the realm of gender studies as well. And it's got into STS in terms of things like multiple epistemologies and the discussion of how we characterize interactions between spermatoa and ova in the fertilization process, and how those things are reflexively oriented to language. That ethnomethodology has accomplished a great deal within sociology often gets overlooked because maybe we're not getting fair credit for it, but we also, if we're paying attention, we'll start to hear these things within our colleagues' research. And I've had the privilege of working in a number of different departments. I've worked in an engineering science department. I've worked in over here in I don't know, gardening or something, landscape planning. And I've worked in sociology and legal studies departments. And in each, and I've had good and bad experiences in both of them. I've worked in a terrible, terrible sociology department that I would gladly see razed to the ground. But I work in a department now where I'm quite happy, and my colleagues come and knock on my door, and they ask me questions about ethno. I mean, it's not about the output of the work or it's that real recognizes real. Right? Like this is people who are doing real research who recognize other people who are doing real research. It doesn't matter if they call themselves ethnos or not. Diane Vaughn's research is amongst the best I've ever read, and is she an ethnomethodologist? Well, yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that she says good things that ethnomethodologists would agree with, but she wouldn't describe it. Karen Norsatina has said some really interesting things in the past. These are people who I will go and listen to them speak as sociologists. There's a lot of sociologists I never want to hear speak, including some who are amongst our ranks. We talk about that. I think that our accomplishments in sociology are oftentimes not recognized by us. That we're not really seeing what it is that we've done. And we've done a lot.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
One of the key aspects of classical sociology has been the idea of figuring out things about the social distribution of knowledge, right, which is part of the basis of the sociology of knowledge. And Garfinkel came up with quite an ingenious way of concretizing that notion. How to find out what kind of knowledge can be distributed in what sorts of circumstances. So he took the case of queuing, right, the queue. So here we have like a natural formation where there's folks in line waiting for some kind of service. And now you have a distribution of knowledge. So the one at the top of the queue, right, basically you can see who came last, right, and who is behind him, and there's that kind of understanding that can be had by being at the top of the queue. Then the last one to the queue can see who's in front, who's going to get the first service, right, and that he's last. But now you've got like the notion of the first come, first serve is the principle by which the one at the top has the knowledge that he has about the relationship he has with the rest of them. I'm at the top, so I'm the first to get served, as distinct from the one behind me, who's the second to get served, and the third in behind me is the third to get served, and the last is the last to get served. Right? So that's like a distribution of knowledge that's given by a naturally occurring quantitative order of a queue. And then he has stuff on traffic as well, where he's talking about, you know, laning, and how, in fact, at one point, I think he sort of was asked to be advised, he was asked by traffic engineers to give him some advice. Do you remember that, Mike?
I don't know whether he was asked to give him advice, but he did have some connection.
He did have a connection with traffic engineers, yeah. And the interesting thing that he was in, he talked about the concertina phenomenon that can occur when traffic gets backed up, right? And the ways in which, how to best accommodate the concertina problem, which is something that he found in traffic. So he's very interested in the distribution of knowledge in terms of the organization of placing of cars, who came last, who can overtake who, and the placing of persons in queues. So he's got this notion of, which is an interesting concretization of the whole question of the social distribution of knowledge that's unique to him.
About sociology's successes and so forth. Well, yes, I guess. I don't know, but on the other hand, the practice of doing an ethnomethodological study, I mean, at least as far as I was or am still concerned, questions the very kind of basis upon which sociology's worldly success usually relies upon, doesn't it? That's the first comment. Secondly, trying to figure out what experimental physicists were up to in terms of their experimental physics. Well, investigating members, relevancies, in situ in a lab, etc. But there's a price to pay for that. So during 1, 2, 3, 4 years, you don't read any science and technology studies, no? You don't read that. You don't have time. You have to bother with STS, but in terms of scanning tunneling spectroscopy, and there's a literature to that, and that's from within that kind of thing that you might wish to understand what the member relevancies were. And thirdly, with respect to giving advice to, say, I don't know, in my case, physicists and so forth, of course, 10 weeks into the study, there's a lab director, so what can you teach us? Or 2 weeks, 2 months later, so how is the lab organized? Or what could this mean in terms of how we should manage things? And then the answer was always, well, the investigation is still underway. So always different at that moment. And in the end, actually, well, it has been dissolved, right? The need for that. And the more you get into the details of the technical practice, the less it seemed to be of interest, certainly for lab management. Well, for some practitioners, it was interesting, so the conversation could be had around that. So I think, but then on the other hand, of course, there's this discussion in Garfinkel's thesis, 1952, I don't know which chapter, where he kind of contrasts a Pearsonian approach to a Schützian one, and what are the initial assumptions for doing sociology. And the Pearsonian approach, I mean, that's my summary, kind of is assuming from the outset that the sociology is talking about the society of its members. Whereas the Schützian approach would be from the outset to stipulate kind of there's a distance, there's a difference between society members' relevancies and the sociologist.
attitude.
Yeah, Wes has a question.
Trying to get in with, sorry,
So,
behind me.
I mean, right on Philippe's thing, I mean, I was 3 weeks doing field work in the Wellman photocopy plant, and the manager comes up and he says, I've got an international quality team and I need some ideas. I said, well, I've only been here 3 weeks. He said, yeah, that was up for next Monday. I'm flying to California. And of course, one of the first things is all of these people in these organisations are desperate for any help they can get. And they'll take anything, pretty much, which is why all those business books do so well and stuff, and why we've got all the managerial jargon in the universities. But I think in terms of ethnomethodology and working with other disciplines, one of the things to remember is the buzzword is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. Ethnomethodologists are just in a great mix of people crossing disciplines. Yeah? And one of the things about most of the interdisciplines is there's no discipline in the interdisciplinary relationships. You know, whereas Harold had this notion that you could take ethnomethodology into these different disciplines and you could address their disciplinary problems. Not their administrative disciplinary problems, their intellectual disciplinary problems. And that would require a very disciplined relationship between the two disciplines to achieve that. But, and I mean, so I think we're in danger of not looking at the broader picture of where ethno fits in this, and how much ethno's successes are attributable to it being ethno. Or whether pretty much anybody who's done some field work can give people in business, administration and the rest some good advice. Yeah? And in my understanding, a little bit derives from kind of any principal connection with ethnomethodology. It has more to do with the nature of the research that you do. And the distinctive bit is you tend to pay more attention to the specifics of the work people are doing than other sociologists do. But I say it is, you know, if we're really interested in assessing where ethno is and what it's doing, then we need to be a bit more cautious about, you know, the environment in which it's doing it and how far. And of course then there's also the question of you know, people talking as if they've cut off from sociology, but they haven't. There's stuff full of sociology. Yeah, their minds are full of sociology. They're addressing sociology, even though they're doing or they're doing sociological stuff on other disciplines, our traditional enemies and stuff. It's not a separation from sociology. It's just an institutional disconnection. And of course, it then raises the question of how are all these things scattered across all these disciplines contributing to ethnomethodology, particularly? Is it just going to be a giant compendium of assorted studies, unconnected to each other, except they were done by people who call themselves ethnomethodologists, but most of them don't read most of them, and nobody knows much about. I mean, so these kind of questions, which seem to me fairly fundamental to assessing where we are.
Doug and Mike. Okay. Doug? Mike. All right. Go on then.
Okay, this is sort of on the same point. In fact, Wes pretty much said what I was going to say. I have as a question, I don't have too many tales of practical success to talk about with people I've studied. And yet I'm happy to grant that other people have, you know, tangible contributions. And my question is, you know, of course, historically in the individual cases, it has to do with coming out of ethnomethodology and being associated with ethnomethodology, and perhaps even having ethnomethodology as a way in to these places, and also getting the inspiration from Garfinkel or whoever that the deep engagement in the practices is what it's about, what both as a prerequisite and as a course of research. And then my question is, you know, a possibility is that when you get into these places and stay there and pick up what people are doing and get asked those kind of questions about what kind of advice you can give, I just wonder what it has to do with ethnomethodology. I think it has to do with people using their wits in circumstances to have a perspective different than people who've worked there, and I mean a personal perspective, lots of different ways, and coming up with stuff, or not, right? Because you can fail, and you can certainly give them advice they've heard before, or they find hackneys and so forth. But the success, I think, can't be traced through principle, can't be traced through methodology, or can it? I mean, that's my question. You know, is there something from ethnomethodology other than the injunction to go into the sites, forget, you know, theorizing before you go in there, and that kind of thing? Does that then provide you both a challenge and an environment in which to face that challenge, to find something to say that people find intelligible and perhaps even helpful?
That's a good question. Doug?
I think I'm spinning out of control, but I think there's a hazard in the formulation of hybrid studies. It's kind of clarified if you actually look at what Garvin was doing. If we imagine hybrid studies as sort of like a disciplinary hybridity, that strikes me as rich and vernacular. Because suddenly you're owing to this other discipline. And I would say, gag, I'm not quite connecting well enough. It's sort of like, I know people who come out of cognitive science and whatnot have taken an introduction to ethno-CA. And it's part of the great arrogance of cognitive science. If they have a degree in cognitive science, they of course can master anything else in 2 weeks. Right? So, I mean, just it's a mangle of their self-assurance is completely unwarranted about these matters. So that has to do with hybridity if you imagine it as a disciplinary intelligence. But if you actually look at Harold Study's work, look, those aren't disciplinary hybridities, right? I mean, it's about, I'm trying to think, well, it's George Gurdon and long distance truck driving. I mean, it's about kung fu, it's about alchemy, right? So there's this other domain of the world that is not endowed with high degrees, about whom, by our discipline study, we can have some revealing things to say. And I want to say, within the disciplines, I'll just offer the example. I think education is the plum. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. Because you have a domain of professional practitioners so impressed by such a thoughtless literature that they're actually thirsty for some understanding of what they can be doing. Right? I mean, they've been assured that what they're actually doing is not what matters, and they have to really consult the literature, otherwise their heads are up their asses. Okay? But you actually have a domain of practice that's so deeply interactional that we're in a position to build descriptions that are instructive descriptions. So, you know, again, I'm a little bit whacked, but I think that the idea of the engagement with the other disciplines just doubles the burden of disciplinary authority and disciplinary implication. And in my advice is to sort of push ourselves away from the table of disciplinarity and try to manage practice.
Doug's given me a very strong hint that it's time to draw this to a conclusion, and that's what I'm about to do. Can I say, though, I think that while we might not think we have, I think we have actually answered, or at least offered Mike some answers to the question that he asked, in that we've put on the table a number of areas, topics, that are well worth examining in a systematic way, but they're different kinds of topics. One is the intellectual topic. And we've come and gone off that, but it's there. What are the intellectual relationships and how do we stand in them? And is it just outflow? What should come back? Second, I think there's the institutional topic. Where do people feel comfortable in the world of work that they're in? And how do we attend to that, given that one fact in our lives as a collectivity is that we're all in different institutional places. And so how do we think about that? And I think the third, and possibly for some of us in the room the most pressing, is what's the career line here? So what's our relationship to the social sciences broadly construed in career terms? And how do we manage that? We've heard very honest statements from some people about how they are having to manage it. And what do we think about that? They are very different questions. I think they are all equally important. And if Mike does want to get an answer to his question, what's the relationship between methodology and the social sciences coming up this discussion, we need characterizations of what the answers would be under those heads. So, thank you all very much for what I think was a very positive.
So let's take until quarter of 4 for coffee and breathers and so forth. But we really do want to start then. So.
You got what you wanted.
Yeah.